Thank you very much for coming on to the podcast, Eric. Don't worry, I'm going to have
Oh,
an intro done for you. So,
oh, I
well,
appreciate that. No, thank you so much for having me, man.
yeah, it's good to get you back. Well, good to get you on this podcast. I know I did have you on the Strength Syndicate podcast way back when. Geez, that was ages ago. But a lot has changed since we last spoke. I think the last time we spoke on that podcast, you were still an amateur bodybuilder, and now you're a pro bodybuilder. That's a pretty big change.
Yeah, it is. So I almost missed your messages because my endorsement sponsors were just knocking at the door after I got my pro
Of course.
card. So there was Nike, Reebok, Adidas, and then I saw your message. Fortunately, it almost got buried. That's just the life of the pro athlete. I had to respond to it. I had to hand it to my manager, and then they handed it to their assistant, and that was who actually responded to the DM. But
Mm.
that's just what it's like to be a pro. So here we are. I had the time. You had to pay me a seven-figure amount to come on, and you had to do that through three different intermediary shell companies. But here we are.
Yeah, I'm never going to financially recover from this podcast. This is the last episode ever. But I think like one thing that was really cool about like watching you win that pro card. So obviously, I was talking to Steve Hall yesterday as well, and like the two of yous have been gunning for that kind of acknowledgement, that reward for a long time, and you kind of finally got it. It was at the Australia show, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, it
Yeah,
was the second to last show of the season, and I had one more potential shot if I needed to take it, and I didn't have to. That
yeah,
I was going to empty the tank, man,
yeah.
and I
That
didn't.
was you were going to try at Worlds, wasn't it?
Well, Worlds was that's actually true. That's true. I did have one other shot at Worlds because you can, of course, compete as an amateur and turn pro there. But there was one more competition, the LA Mayhem, that I could have done in California. Stayed with some family. It would have been 2 weeks out from Worlds, and I would have probably been in even more debt. I joked about like getting all the money you get from getting a pro card. Absolutely not the case. Even as a pro in natural bodybuilding, you're losing money for the cost of, as flying to
Mm.
compete internationally, etc. So, yeah, I was willing to go take one more shot at the LA Mayhem. And actually, when I saw the competition there, I don't think I could have done it. There were some really good athletes there. So, yeah, no, it was one of those things. It was a war of attrition, and I had a really good season, and the chips fell my way, and we did it. Yeah.
I think the fact that you competed in powerlifting me during that prep
hmm
was pretty impressive, and you did quite well, didn't you? It set some records, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I set a local M1
Yeah.
bench record in the Auckland region. So, yeah, I mean, let's put it this way. It was my first on the books meet as an
Mm.
83 kilo lifter, period. So it was, you know, at 6 foot, that makes no sense unless you understand competitive natural bodybuilding. So yeah, no, it was really successful for me because less so on the objective performance compared to my peers,
Mm.
but where I was at in terms of strength at the start of prep, and then where I was at the end, because I had not been competing and training for powerlifting. I was pretty damn committed to uh, prepping, for
Yeah.
the 2023 season. So it had been basically a year away from me trying to be at peak strength for powerlifting. I was kind of doing like minimum effective dose stuff. So yeah, I totaled reasonably well considering I had basically lost from 96 down to making weight at 83 from the start of
Mm.
prep to end. And I didn't start introducing specific powerlifting training until like the February 2023 mark when I did it. And I essentially increased my squat and deadlift while dieting. And the only thing that I took a hit on was my bench, which is pretty common.
Yeah,
Um,
makes sense.
yeah.
So with the powerlifting training there, I'm curious. You did mention like the minimum dose. So how did you incorporate that in with the bodybuilding work? Because I definitely know, like when I was doing my prep, I was fairly stubborn to keep in as much powerlifting stuff as I could up until it just became, it's just not worth doing. Like, for trade off of, like, doing leg press or doing like machine chest press or something, and just downright getting depressing. Um, but I did find that, like, squat maintained pretty well, deadlift maintained pretty well, relatively, like, for relative body weight. But once I kind of went off them, like, that's where my strength just went down the toilet. Like, my first bench session back after I did Worlds in 2022, I'd, like, start with 90 kilos, and I felt like, ugh. It was very, very embarrassing. But I'm very, very curious as to, like, how you incorporated that in, like, during prep, because, yeah, I guess there's always the opportunity cost there of, like, that could be an extra set of leg press.
Exactly, and that was kind of something that I was trying to juggle, and I enjoyed juggling. It's something I got a lot of experience with, juggling on an even more complicated scale when I was competing a few years back in 2020 and 2021 during COVID. Not that I tried to do it during COVID. COVID kind of messed it up. I was juggling strongman, weightlifting, powerlifting, all simultaneously, and so I had this kind of rotation of all these different strength movements. But this was far easier and something I've been doing for years. I did my first powerlifting meet in 2006, and I've done 20 now. So essentially what I did was, because I had February and I didn't compete until North Islands. I want to say that was in July. And it could have been June. They both start with J. It was a long time ago which month it was, but somewhere mid-year is when I did it. And what I was doing, I was ramping up my frequency of doing heavy singles with back-offs. And after that, I was literally doing nothing else until I got real close to competition. And then it was a little more, for like one mesocycle, it was pretty powerlifting specific with just a sufficient amount of bodybuilding to make sure that I was, keeping the physique where it needed to be. So we started with just like a 2-3-1 frequency on the squat, bench, deadlift. On each one of those days, I would do 2 lifts, no more than that. So bench and squat or bench and deadlift. And sometimes just one, just depending upon my workout schedule, because I was training 6 days a week during prep. I tend to train more frequently so that my individual training sessions don't last as long. So I find that works better with the energy levels I have during prep. I didn't really need to think about that for the first 4 or 5 months because I don't know, personally, I don't really start getting beat up by prep until I'm a lot leaner. So anyway, up until the meet, things were pretty good, and I was training 6 days a week, so I could almost completely divvy up those 6 lifts. And I would come in, work up to a single, and then I would do, on some days, but not all, 2 back-off sets as a double or a triple, somewhere between the 80 to 85% range of that single. And that was it. So we're talking for bench, I was doing like 8 to 10 sets totally. And they were all singles, doubles, or triples at a relatively high RPE. I was getting some volume work on other forms of bench just for my bodybuilding training, though, like close grip, I shouldn't say close grip. Close grip for a powerlifter at bench is max legal, so like shoulder width grip, not major arch, but shoulders tucked.
Yeah.
And then I was doing some other work that would probably count as accessory movement stuff for powerlifting that could serve the dual purpose of hypertrophy. Some RDLs, did a few other variations of squats, but for the most part, that was all I was doing. So I had like 3 sets of deadlift a week, 6 sets of squats per week, and like 9 sets of bench per week. And then once I got to the last 2 months, I upped the frequency on deadlifts to one other day, squats one other day, and then bench one other day. So I went from like a 2-3-1 to like a 3-4-2. And that was when I brought all of my bodybuilding stuff down to maintenance. But we're talking like 6 weeks, I think, if I recall correctly. It was a pretty short period, and it did work. It worked very well. The only thing I couldn't really, the only thing I look back on and kind of wish that I had done a little bit differently, and it's not possible, but it made me, I was pleasantly surprised with how well my strength held up. Like I basically lost, maybe like 15 kilos off my bench, dropping 13 kilos of body weight, and I increased my squat from where it was, and I increased my deadlift from where it was, but not to my peak ever. So my best lifts as a power lifter are 227 squat, 155 bench, and a 260 deadlift. And based upon how that prep went, I feel like there's probably a reality where I had gotten close to that peak, then dieted, and maybe I was able to put up something like a 220 and a 250 squat and deadlift, and maybe like a 140 bench versus I think I did, I want to say I did like 205 and 235 on squat and deadlift, and then like a 132 bench. So it was like a quick, let me get my numbers back up to a reasonable amount, and then kind of like slowly maintain them is kind of what happened. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's a pretty cool proof of concept with the minimum effective dose that like Pac did, because like that pretty much just sounds like what like the protocol that you used, and it's nice to see it like kind of bear out, because I know like as part of their study they got like, was it members of the Greek national powerlifting team or people doing Greek nationals or something that were like running that specific protocol too. It's something that I guess when I'm coaching people as well, they find it so hard to like let go of like doing like lots of volume, doing lots of sets. If they do want to shift to a different goal, they want to shift more towards like building muscle, and it's just really, really nice to, obviously there's research there, but like, when you hear from an anecdote, right, like from one person, it feels more like, this seems something that's a little bit more legit.
Yeah, it's like the proof is in the pudding kind of thing. Yeah, even though when you read a study, those were real people. I think it's when someone and they can give you the individual context. It does certainly allow you to kind of play and see with the idea and put a little more of that faith in it. But yeah, Pac actually did a fair amount of research on that. He did do the one with the Greek powerlifting team. Then he also did separate research on another group. So there was, when you look at the multiple studies he's done, it's all in powerlifters too, for relatively short time periods, which I think is important to know. It does hold up, but he at the EPC actually, Pac did a presentation. He shared with everyone there that he did this with one of his long-term clients who was, very strong, national level competitor, totaling, I want to say like close to 800 if I recall correctly, who trained like that just because of his work schedule. And when you really think about it, it's the power of specificity that you're leveraging, right? Yeah. So doubles, singles, and triples at the 80% of 1RM or higher range, they do a lot. And you don't need a whole lot of that type of training to kind of, at least in the short term, maximize that skill side of it. And, I think it's difficult to compare me to that study because I was also doing like 20 sets of bodybuilding work per muscle group across 6 days a week. So, like the idea that I wasn't getting additional volume, it's like I wasn't getting additional big three specific volume. But I mean, if you were to look at it through the lens of a powerlifter and like, oh, he's doing like 3 to 8 different, depending upon the week, accessory movements for the big three, in some form or another. So, it was more of just, how much can I tolerate? Where can I fit it in and still get what I need to do to get done for bodybuilding to compete at my best?
Yeah, do as much as you need to still get the strength kind of outcome that you want, but not let it take away from what the kind of ultimate goal is. Your kind of trajectory has changed, I guess, away from powerlifting now, all completely altogether. Is what I'm trying to say. Towards the bodybuilding goal now, like since winning the pro card, and I know that's come with like, your training seems to be very high volumes. You've been doing quite a lot of it, so I'm really kind of curious as to hear like with the judges' feedback from like Worlds last year when you did your pro debut at Worlds, wasn't it?
I did.
Yeah. I'm interested to hear what was the judges' feedback. What have you and how have you kind of baked that into your training now across like the last?
Yeah. The main feedback I got was basically I just need to be bigger. I came in pretty damn good condition at Worlds. It was my best physique ever, at my pro debut, which you can't ask for more. But, for me, best physique ever on the pro middleweight bodybuilding stage at WBF Worlds was good for 7th out of 9th. And I see that as an accomplishment, that there were pros who I actually placed higher than. I'm like, oh, like maybe I legitimately, earned this spot. So even though it is such a high caliber, and even though, I went from being a top amateur to bottom of the pack at Worlds, man, I was only ecstatic about that experience. And it was something that I didn't know that I would be able to accomplish. So getting there felt like the prize in and of itself, which was pretty cool. I think there's probably a world where I'd place 9th, and I was actually disappointed because it would make you think, well, did I even deserve to be here? I should have been on stage. But I only apply that to myself. Like I look at the gentleman who placed 8th, and I look at the gentleman who placed 9th, and they're amazing bodybuilders. They are pros. They earned it. They deserve to be there. But of course, if I did it, I probably didn't deserve it,
Yeah.
But the feedback I got was generally I need to be bigger. Condition was great, and to the standard necessary there. And then when I talked more specifically to the rest of the 3DMJ coaches, they gave me like some feedback looking at kind of the game footage of me posing at Worlds. It was basically the same, like everything needs to be bigger, but there were, I'd say, specific areas that I needed to work on, that I needed to continue to work on, just because of my structure. So more width, I think, is going to be the forever goal of me, because I'm 6 foot. I don't have the widest shoulders. I don't have the largest rib cage, and I don't have, that's pretty much it, right? So, and when you come out on stage in a big pro class like that, you've seen it. It's true of the amateurs as well. You hit front relaxed, and you're standing there for at least 5 minutes, and that is the first impression of everybody. They're looking especially in the WNBF that has a symmetry and a muscularity round for bodybuilding. The way to think of that is that essentially the judges are trying to look at you like your silhouettes. And whoever looks like that classic X-frame, V-taper, sweeping quads, it makes a really big impression. And it's almost, that pose it's not quite, it's almost half your score when you think about it for symmetry and muscularity. Obviously you do quarter turns, but side relax is important, but it's typically not going to be the thing that really solidifies where you're at. It's front relaxed, and then to a slightly lesser degree, just because it's not the first impression, back relaxed. So for me, anything I can do to get my quads, my lats, and my shoulders further away from my waist and create more of that classic taper, the better. So the emphasis is middle deltoid, delts overall, back, and to some degree even quads, that was a new thing. Shane, it's an interesting thing. Like the way we evaluate amateurs and pros is slightly different. Amateurs, you can have standout body parts and things that really push you forward. Like, oh man, did you see that one competitor was so shredded? Or man, you saw that guy with the legs. Or, oh dude, he's so big. Man, if he got in good condition, he would be a really incredible pro. But he's good enough to get a pro card. That happens all the time. You have amateurs who have either kind of they're mediocre across the board, and they're placed in second. Like they're pretty big, pretty symmetrical, box glutes, but they're not shredded. They're going to do well at an amateur show, if we're talking men's bodybuilding. Or you get someone who is kind of like a bit of a specialist, like not great structure, really shredded, decent size, or some combination of those factors. And then when you win your pro card, it's typically when you're good at 2 of those or more, right? So your structure, muscularity, or your condition is okay, and the other 2 things are lights out, Yeah. So at the pro level, though, everyone is like that. So everything that was acceptable, that wasn't necessarily a priority, is now a weak point. So for me, if you looked at my amateur career, it was one where I started to do better once I got my upper body to match my lower body, because I was bottom heavy earlier in my career. And I did that for 2023, and I was rewarded for it. But then the feedback I got was, you could actually use a little more leg size, like your glutes and your quads are a little small, and your upper body needs to come up as well. So it was just like, I thought I'd maybe be doing another kind of like specialization off season like I did to succeed in 2023, but is it a specialization cycle when your coaches list every single body part except for like two, or is it just get bigger, you small bastard? And that's more so what it was.
Yeah. One thing that I remember John Jewett saying, I did his his J3U course, and he was just talking about, like, you know, when you're doing like your physique analysis after a show or something like that, like you're always you compare to the winner. You're just like saying, like, what does the winner of what's the overall winner, what's he got, and what do I not have? Like, what, like, because like that's what they're gonna be. That's what that class of judges were looking for. Like, it could be they could have a symmetry bias, they could have a muscularity bias, but like there's gonna be some attributes that that person has that you don't have, and you need to say, okay, well, which of these body parts, or what side it could is it conditioning or whatever, do you need to be bringing up coming into the next season? How has your training like changed relative to like the previous like contest? The previous, like, I guess gaining phase or off season phase. Now that you've kind of got that feedback, and like I'm always like really curious as well with people like in your position who you obviously have a lot going on. Like, you know, you work in AUT, like you're writing the muscle strength pyramids, volume 3. Like, you know, do you work with mass 3MJ, fucking traveling all the time? Like, how on earth, like, do you find time, even find the time to get the training done?
Well, I tell you what, it has always been a priority for me, and I have the closest thing I've ever done to sacrificing training for other things that I've had to do in life was during some pretty intense periods of my PhD. I tried training 3 days per week, and those sessions were 2.5 hours to get through what I wanted to get through. And what I ultimately ended up doing, and this is a really important learning, we're talking back in 2016, 2017, was I trained 6 days per week for 45 minutes. I also had the fortune of being in a sports science program. So at AUT Millennium, where my office is and where I did my PhD as well, I would just go downstairs to train. So there was no commute time. So I was possible. Not everyone has that luxury. And now I also have the luxury of having a home gym. But to answer your question, so that's just to give people some background, is that I don't know that I've ever missed a scheduled workout in my 20-year time of training, except for times when I was extremely ill. I remember there were a couple times where I did not know that the gym was closed because of the holidays, and found myself doing dips on a bench, incline push-ups, pistol squats, pull-ups on the gymnasium, that type of thing. Like, it was I didn't know it in 2008 or whatever it was, but it was a preview of COVID for me, right? Yeah. So that is who I am. I don't miss training, period. And that said, I still have to do all the things I have to do. And around the holidays, when I'm traveling and when I have a lot going on like this, or actual physically scheduled locations where I have to be, the thing that I love to do and that I find is really, really helpful is just getting up first thing and training. So whenever I travel, I make sure that I'm at a hotel that has a sufficient gym, and I'm very creative, or it is close to a gym that is within 5 to 15 minute walking distance. And I find out when's the earliest the gym opens, and I'm there. Because it's before everybody else gets up, it's before anything's going on, and I know that it's done. Is it my preferred time to train? No. You know, like currently at home now, I typically train in the afternoon, or like early or late afternoon. That's when I feel my best. I've got enough food in me. You know, I've gotten some work done, and I need a good break from it anyway. So that's how I handle it. Some other things that I do that enable me to get through the work I'm doing is that I do a ton of antagonist paired sets and peripheral supersets. So if I'm doing a press movement, it's going to be paired with a pull. If I'm doing a bicep movement, it's going to be paired with a push or a tricep, et cetera, et cetera. And that can cut you down, you know, like a third off of your workout time. And anytime I'm finishing the work I'm going to do for a given muscle, so it's not going to be something else, and it's not a compound lift that would really create a lot of cardiorespiratory fatigue. I'm doing drop sets or rest pause, doing a few more sets to get kind of the equivalent of what I would get out of straight sets. So those are time efficiency things that are massive. You know, a drop set compared to doing, say, 3 straight sets, if you did 1 top set and 3 drops, you're taking about a third of the time now. Now it's way more time efficient because this is 1 extended set. The final thing I'll say is I'm friendly when I come to the gym and I show up, but I'm not hanging out with my friends.
Yeah.
I show up, you know, I train with a workout partner, and when we're training, we are training. And we have a little, you know, we have a chat before, we have a chat after as we're warming up and stuff like that. But for a good solid, you know, 70 to 80 minutes, we are just training. And when I'm on there on my own, I've got my headphones in, and I'm not rude, but I'm not there to socialize. I am there to train. And everyone knows that, you know, and that's something that I really do appreciate, that people respect that. And it's, you know, like if someone wants to work in, you know, I pop my headphone off. I'm not, like I said, I'm just clearly there with a purpose. And I don't allow myself to, I don't have the luxury of being able to have, like social time at the gym. So those are some things that some people love about training. So I said all of that before I even told you what my training is, because I think it's critical to understand that that is some of the things that are necessary to have a busy schedule in life like I do, and to do the amount of work that I'm doing, because it's not a small amount.
Yeah. I think what you said at the very beginning of that, though, is like something that a lot of people should try to tell themselves more. It's like, I'm not the type of person who misses workouts. Like, I don't miss workouts, you know, because like I think it's when people start saying I'll try to get to the gym, or I'll try fit it in, that like once they say they are going to try, that is an automatic, like, it's not going to happen. It's the exact same as saying like maybe kind of just means no. You know. So I think just like starting that like little bit of switch in your mind to say, I'm not the type of person who like miss the gym. I am training today, I'm training this week, this is my workout schedule. And I think when you put your back against the wall as well, and just like commit to it as being part of like your weekly routine, you start to maneuver around it like as you do, like you do, you're like, right, I'm gonna train, I have to train, right, I'm gonna do my supersets, I'm gonna do my rest pause, my drop sets, right. They're no less effective, and they're certainly more effective than not going to the gym. You know, it's like it's not trying to be perfect all the time. Like even like training at different times. In the morning time, as you said, you don't like training in the morning time. Like most people don't like training in the morning time either, or like training when you're traveling. Like, you know, I've been traveling a lot across like the last year too, and I've had a lot of people like ask me like, how do I continue to train? How do I still manage to, like, you know, get all my work done? And it's just a case of like, I have to get it done. Like, I just don't really have any other options. Like, especially when I'm doing powerlifting. Like, powerlifting is like the simplest thing ever to do when you're traveling. Is if you have a barbell and some plates and a rack and a bench, you're sorted. It might not be Alico, it might not be calibrated plates, but like, I didn't always have that stuff. So I may as well just like get to work. And I don't know, there's like some Eastern European powerlifters that I follow, like, they don't have access to calibrated plates, and they are freakishly strong. You know, that's not holding them back. But yeah, no, I think all that context is super important, because there's going to be people listening to this podcast, and I think the perception is when they listen to people like either myself or yourself, they might be like, sure, this is like, you know what, this is what he does for a living. He probably has plenty of time to, like, you know, fit in the gym, like 2.5 hours to train, la di da. They don't know how busy my life is, but like, you know, you're definitely way busier than I am, and like, you know, you're still able to get it in just from that part of being like, I do train, I don't miss sessions, and you are a professional bodybuilder, so you're going to carry yourself like a pro.
Yeah, and it's something that has been true since I started training in 2004. So it is very much a mindset, and my personality lends itself towards that. So like, I get very obsessive about things I care about, and I think most importantly, I love training. You know, so like, it's kind of like, you know, maybe this is a little crass, but like, I also like I've been married for a long time. I have a very good relationship with my wife. If at 5 a.m. she woke up and like nudged me, and she's like, "Hey, do you want to have a quick roll in the hay?" I'm not going to say no, right? So with with maybe that'll change once I'm even older. But and by the way, for the record, that doesn't happen. My wife doesn't wake me up at 5 a.m. But if she did, I would be open to it, right? So for things that you love, I think it is. Like I would rather do this at 8 p.m. or in that case, or I would rather train at 2 p.m. when I have had lunch and breakfast in me, and it's the gym is empty instead of busy with all the people who are trying to get it done before work, etc. But it's still something I love. So there was a great quote from Brian Whitaker, who I had the pleasure of interviewing for Iron Culture with Omar. And this is a man who has won multiple world titles, who's been incredibly committed, who I would argue just has very, very good genetics, but not the best genetics in bodybuilding. Yet he was the first person who united the titles of the Yorton Cup and WBF Worlds, and he's a legend in the sport. And he is someone who makes me look not busy, because he's a full professor of economics in a big university, and he has a family. And that's something that I have to my advantage. I don't have kids, So there's a guy with multiple kids and a full-time professorship. And he is a world champ. And when he gives you his priority list, I think bodybuilding's typically third in his, or even fourth. I can't remember if he put spirituality, his job, and then his family. Not in that order, by the way, for the record. I'm pretty sure his job came after family. And then bodybuilding. And he did, and this is someone who gets absolutely peeled and is known for his work ethic. So he is the poster boy for taking himself as far as he can and it being good enough to win a world title. Multiple world titles, right? So you would think that he would be the iconic sacrifice to win type of guy, but how does he do it all? And he said, I optimize within the constraints of my life. So the process is not thinking about whether the grass is greener on the other side. It's going, what are my non-negotiables? What can I do? What must I do? And then where do I fit in the closest thing to optimal as possible? Because the secret hint, Shane, the reality is that's actually all that we're ever doing. It's just in our monkey brains as athletes. We think, no, like it's either got to be perfect, whatever that made up construct is, or it's bad and it has a negative view. But that's never true. I guarantee you, I think I could take any given person's approach to any given task, problem, or thing. And because we don't have a crystal ball, we don't know everything in the world. It's not perfect, even if you think it is. It's just emotionally soothing to think that it's perfect, right? So if we could have a perfect knowledge and a supercomputer that was, could predict everything and that would ever happen in the universe, we could go, actually, if you did X, Y, and Z with your training, nutrition, and sleep, it would be better than what you're currently doing. So we're never optimal, period. We are striving towards that, but it's always within the constraints of what we're willing to do. I mean, hell, we're all natural bodybuilders, right? We would get better gains if we took anabolic steroids. We choose not to. We're optimizing within the constraints of a given set of precepts, no matter what. So I think that mindset needs to be at the beginning of all programming. Like what adherence, right? Adherence at the base of the pyramid. What are we going to do within the confines of you, of your life, your needs, etc.? And there's still a lot to be done there because, I didn't actually answer your original question, Shane. What the hell am I actually doing? Currently, I am training daily, and sometimes I go to the gym twice because I am trying to figure out a way to do the amount of off-season work that I was doing that will still be sustainable through prep. So I'm experimenting with using my home gym, and I changed gyms about, I want to say it was 4 or 5 months ago now. I started training at the AUT gym because they very graciously are giving free memberships to all the sport and rec staff and students. So I was training in a different home gym and at my home gym and at a different gym. But now that there's just the the AUT gym in the city, I'm a 10-minute walk from the gym, or I'm a 1 floor trip down to my garage to train. And the garage is a little more suited for like weightlifting and powerlifting, and it's not as time efficient, even considering those 2 10-minute walks, because of the machines that are available in the commercial gym. So most of the time I walk and go to the commercial gym. Sometimes I train in the other AUT gym that I drive to with my workout partner, and then sometimes I go downstairs. But I am doing on average 20 to 30 sets per muscle group. And that's counting fractional sets. So like bench would be half a set for triceps as an example, but a full set for anterior delts or pecs. And I am training daily, and like sometimes on a couple days per week, twice a day, I will get in like quads and calves in the morning, and then not the morning, but like the early afternoon, late morning, and then in the late afternoon, early evening, I will go do my upper body work for that day. So it's like 2 45 to 50-minute sessions. And that kind of connects to really how much work can you do in like for your job. So the whole kind of rise and grind mentality and put in all this work, I can tell you as someone who does a lot of work that ain't nobody out there clocking more than 4 hours in a row of really productive, efficient work. You start to fall off. So what I do, I have a very good flow, and that I've learned works well for me and my productivity. Right now we're recording this. I'm doing a 6 a.m. podcast with you, right? So typically from when I wake up till mid to late morning, I do emails and I schedule meetings and podcasts. And then once I've kind of done that, breakfast gets fit in there. I let it digest while I do a bit of writing. And then, I find a stopping point in writing, and then I go train if I'm doing a 2-a-day, or I just keep writing, take a break for lunch, and then I will go to my afternoon workout. But breaking up work into chunks, like getting up for 2 45-minute periods to train. I mean, if you look at the typical office worker, even if they're there for an 8-hour day, especially in Europe too, you got your morning tea, you got lunch, the lunch turns into a 2-hour break. You've got meetings that have like a 20-minute preamble and a 20-minute post-amble that you're talking about nothing. Half the meetings don't matter. There's the water cooler talk or the proverbial one. Like, most people are probably out of an 8-hour day realistically working for 4. So for me, I'm aware of that, and I structure my breaks into productive things that I'm enjoying that are different and break it up. So I don't try to only write for a given day unless I have a deadline, because I know that writing gets massively inefficient once you start to hit that wall. So I will switch to emails, or I will switch to a social media post, or I'll switch to making a video, or I'll switch to something else. And I have kind of a flow to my day, and I've worked in those training sessions. And I only need to find 90 minutes, like when you really, really think about it.
Yeah.
So my total amount of time spent in the gym per week is probably, I would say now, maybe 8 to 9 hours. And that's very, very manageable when it really comes down to it, even though I'm doing what many would consider a very high volume.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too dissimilar to myself, who does 4 2-hour sessions a week, except it just like from an outside, because I don't do it, it seems like more just because it's more to and from, but obviously you don't have that long of a commute, so it doesn't really sound like, it's probably not as bad as I probably think it would be. It's also really interesting to hear how your day went. I was gonna kind of just ask you that to see how you set up your workflow, because I'd be generally the same. I find that past a certain amount of hours of work done, especially with the doing check-ins and stuff like that, it just, work quality just decreases. There's definitely a limit to how many check-ins I can do a day before my brain just starts to melt and I start to lose any empathy that I have within my body. And as a coach, that's probably not where you want to get to. Or else those final few check-ins that come in, they're getting the stick.
That's right. No carrot, all stick. Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, so that kind of brings us on to like a next question, right? And I guess you kind of mentioned you're doing a lot of writing at the moment, and that's, obviously you got your work with mass, and one of the big ones is the new muscle and strength pyramids that are coming out. So if anybody hasn't read the muscle and strength pyramids, you can get the most up to date version coming out in insert date here. But volume number 3 is coming out, so it's very, very exciting.
Yeah.
So, Eric, like, what has changed since like the last ones came out? Like, I mean, like, has much even changed in training? Like, like some people would say that we already know all the stuff that's coming out, but obviously we don't.
I basically rewrite my books. I don't have like a planned schedule. There's no publisher. It's like, hey, we need to do the third edition. I want to make some money. It's basically when I look back at my old books and they annoy me to the point where I can no longer stand it, that they're out of date. And that's where we're at. I finished writing the second editions in late 2018. And there were certain things that had come out that had really started to bother me, like a bunch of frequency meta-analyses. We had shifted towards counting sets as volume, and I was actually counting reps back in the first edition. Because that's and things have changed even more. Now we have these fantastic series of meta-regressions that have come out, done by the data-driven strength crew over at Florida Atlantic University. Led by Pelland and Robinson, and there's another one soon to come led by Remmert. And we have a much better understanding of exercise selection now, and how manipulating resistance profiles, the muscle length you train at, can influence hypertrophy. We have a better understanding. We were talking about the minimum effective dose. We see how different, actually, the volume or the volumes you can benefit from are for strength and hypertrophy. And that was something they were relatively similar in terms of the volumes that were being recommended not too long ago for both strength and hypertrophy, because we hadn't explored higher volumes. We understand the minimum effective dose better. We understand the relationship between proximity to failure and hypertrophy and strength, which not only differ between one another, they differ from the understanding we had even just 2 years ago. So a fair amount has changed. I would even say that we have a better understanding of tempo and the nuances of how that actually differs for strength and hypertrophy. And it's one of those things that could be very simply explained, but there's enough people who overcomplicate it that people get it wrong. So helping someone have a conceptual understanding of how to manipulate it, or how not to manipulate it so that they don't necessarily take away from their own stimulus. And then finally, like a lot of the time-saving techniques that we just talked about, drop sets, rest pause, antagonist paired sets, they certainly existed. These aren't new concepts, but actually being able to know how and why and when they can be just as effective but still save time as traditional training. And then what is the trade-off? If I'm going to do drop sets, if I'm going to do rest pause, if I'm going to do antagonist paired sets, and I'm going to make my typical 2-hour workout now take 70 minutes, how is that going to impact me and my training overall, and what things and considerations do I need to make so that I'm not losing stimulus while gaining that time advantage? And those are all things that populate the third edition. And there's much more of a discussion around how to understand data interpretation. Also, a little more, I would say I'm teaching by showing the reader how to become a better critical thinker more intentionally, because there's so much more information out there. One of the goals of the books is so that they don't read it and go, okay, cool, and then find some other piece of content and go, oh, maybe, well, that sounds convincing, So I try to explain to them why I'm using this piece of research to back it up, or why this anecdote helps with that. So there's a lot of work being done to hopefully give the readers better protection against the problem, which has only increased since the second edition, of being overwhelmed by information and not being able to gauge what is accurate. So building their bullshit sensor, for lack of a better terminology, is something I've also built in. And that's just the training side. The nutrition side has some changes as well, which we could get into if you'd like.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to. I have an idea of some of them just from like paying attention, but you know, like I'm all ears.
Yeah, so the nutrition book, I would say there's less changes in the nutrition book than there are the training book, but they're important changes in the nutrition book. We have a better understanding now. It's going to be dropping soon. Meta-regression that I worked on with Dr. Eric Trexler and Dr. Martin Ruffalo that went all the way back to my first publication, my systematic review on protein intake and lean dieting strength athletes, which was in press in 2012 and fully published, I think, in early 2014, where we suggested, hey, there's a theoretical rationale for higher protein intakes. That paper was, it's cited a lot as quote-unquote proof that you need higher protein while dieting, but that's probably not epistemologically an accurate thing to say. I was able to point out that in the studies that met the inclusion criteria, which is like 6, that the groups that had higher protein intakes were also the groups that maintained more lean mass. But only like 2 of those studies was that actually the experimental question, right? What I mean by that is that, they took 2 different groups and controlled for everything, measured changes in lean body mass while dieting and lifting weights, and one group was on higher protein, one group was on lower. There's only 2 studies. All the other ones were times when people lifting weights who were lean were dieting, and I could figure out what their protein intakes were and then comparing across them. That's the equivalent of like epidemiology or observational research. It's not a controlled trial. And we didn't do a proper meta-regression. So this is low-quality evidence, ultimately. But 10 years later, we actually had enough to do a meta-regression. And we have data specifically that goes back and looks at it. And now we can empirically say with a higher degree of confidence, yeah, it really does seem like, higher protein is better when dieting. So we're able to talk about that. And there's been more updates on macronutrients. And one of the biggest things that has changed my coaching practice, it's also changed a lot of the other 3DMJ coaches' coaching practice, is kind of the realization that calories and protein is probably just as good and arguably better than hitting specific macros. And that can bristle the typical bodybuilder who feels like, well, I can be more precise by tracking macros. But precision is only helpful to the degree that it actually is helpful. Additional precision beyond reaching, the optimal outcome is just additional work or limitations for someone. And I think you can understand this if you have like a coaching business and you work with people across multiple geographic locations. Like the macro splits that we often think of in kind of the West, they're hard to hit in certain regions. They're hard to hit with certain lifestyles, and the foods that we know how to use to hit our certain targets don't even exist in certain parts of, say, Asia, India, or they're not the preferences at the very least, right? So one of the things that I started doing was going, look, you are, when we're talking to the kind of audience we have, Shane, someone who has been lifting for a while, knows how to track their nutrition, has competed in many cases, or is competing for the first time, but has been doing the macros thing for a while, if you will. They have a structured eating habit. Like if they didn't count their macros, they would still be hitting pretty close to those macros on a day-to-day basis if they just follow their typical habits. And in that type of context, it's really hard to justify why, say, 220 grams of carbs is any different than 265 grams of carbs with 20 grams of less or more fat, but the same amount of calories. It's just it's a 180 calorie swing towards carbs or fat. We're talking an apple and a half of carbohydrates, right? We're talking a larger tablespoon of nut butter, right? It's really not that much. Yet people are typically hitting their macros within plus or minus 5 grams, or 10 grams at most. Why? I can't justify it. We have no data. So anecdotally, I don't think it matters. Logically, I don't think it matters. Experientially, it doesn't matter. And then in the research, it really doesn't seem to matter when we take a look at relatively high and relatively low carbohydrate diets, so long as protein is there. Long as you're not going like keto, it seems to be decently okay, you know. Now, there are individual differences, don't get me wrong, but this has shifted me towards, all right, what is the minimum fat, carb, and protein intake that I would like someone to hit? So I'm still giving macro guidance. And then what's the calorie range? And all of a sudden, this gives someone tremendously more flexibility. Like, I think of it as macros 2.0. Like, you know, the first kind of iteration of macros was just, okay, I have a rigid meal plan that, you know, I saw Flex Wheeler follow, or whatever my favorite IFBB pro is, or my coach who's told me this is the magic clean food diet. And I was exposed to the idea that I could just fit different foods, oh my God, that are not on the bodybuilding list into these macros. My life has changed. And, you know, that kind of that Christmas feeling wore off of that present pretty quick as people started taking their, you know, their food scales with them to the restaurant and feeling like they were still trapped by a rigid diet despite having these three magic numbers, because they were having to hit 62 grams of fat on a day-to-day basis, right? I see this as macros 2.0. Like, if I go, okay, my minimum intake for fat on a day-to-day basis is 40 grams. My minimum intake for carbohydrates is, you know, 150 grams. And my minimum intake for protein is 160 grams. But after that, I've got a 700 calorie buffer to do what I want. It makes social events easier. It makes coaching someone in a totally different region with different food availability easier. It makes when someone's traveling easier. It just makes everything better. And it also gives an athlete in prep, if they have the right coaching and they have the right level of experience, more autonomy, because they can go, you know, this is one of those days where I think I would do better with a higher or lower carb or fat intake. And you can even just use those minimums as a target and go, right, this is going to be a digging day if you set it up in the right way. It's a slightly different topic than minimum macro intakes, because you would probably want a minimum calorie intake. But this is something you can give a calorie range with, where you don't actually have to adjust your macronutrient guidance. You can keep those same minimums and say, I'd like you to hit between 1,700 and 2,100 calories. By the way, if your step count's lower, if your energy's fine, you know, yada, 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 adjust your calories up and down as you see fit, so long as we're on pace with our fat loss. And now all of a sudden, experienced competitors can leverage their own experience to a greater degree, because I think a lot of the times when you coach someone, as they become more and more experienced, if you don't adjust your protocols, you can start holding back more advanced and experienced athletes. You know, the veterans you work with, their intuition is going to tell them when they might do better with a low or a high day, more or less cardio, changing their workout schedule. And if your protocols are too rigid, you basically take that option away from them. And they might have been doing better on their own without you, you know, because they would feel like they were able to make those changes and calls. So if you can have protocols which build in that type of flexibility for your more veteran athletes who have good self-awareness and also good self-regulation, then that can be a net win for both parties.
Yeah, I really like using that approach with my clients for nutrition, because it does generally just give them, like as you said, a little bit more autonomy, but also demystifies nutrition a little bit. Like, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of unhelpful information around nutrition out there, but I think on like our side of things, sometimes the messaging around like how precise you need to be with macros when people discover it, and it could come from, like, you know, bodybuilders kind of pushing on, like, you know, the level of neuroticism that they're used to onto everybody else, and if they are not following that, then they just don't want it bad enough. I think that, well, turns people away from using an approach like tracking macros, or like being a little bit more flexible with their diets, and allowing them to actually incorporate more foods, be more inclusive with the diet, right? And then they kind of go towards like the clean food approach. I just need to cut out X, Y, and Z to, like, you know, make it work. And it ultimately just like lands flat on its face. And like, I coach like a lot of powerlifters just purely for nutrition. And obviously I have like my training and nutrition clients. And like when I'm working with them from a nutrition capacity, sometimes they're kind of a little bit like, is that it? Like, when I like kind of give them maybe like the macro recommendation, then I give them some like qualitative measures that I kind of want them to, like, you know, kind of aim towards, like, you know, protein at each meal, like, you know, X amount of servings of like fruit and veg throughout the day, like, you know, try spread your meals out, like, just to like form some type of structure for yourself. Like, you know, maybe eat without distractions, this kind of stuff. You know, just giving them these like little pointers of just like behaviors, routines that they can have, that they can form around food that might kind of be suitable for them towards their goals, versus it being, okay, we need to be having like 200 grams of sirloin steak, not fillet steak, sirloin steak, because it has a little bit more fat there, a little bit more saturated fat. Then we're gonna have over here some chia seeds, and it's gonna have a bit of that fucking ALA, omega-3, like fatty acids, like there. I've seen people get like meal plans like that and like get like recommendations of that, and it's just so unnecessary. It adds such a unnecessary level of complication to people's day. Like, nutrition is something that should run in the background in autopilot. So like, what's the easiest way to get somebody to get to that place? It's quite often giving them only enough rules that's going to give them, or enough rules or enough guidance that's going to give them a structure, but it's not going to be too outside of what they're currently doing. You know, it's like the stretch goals. Like, you know, you want to go a little bit outside of what you're currently doing versus something that's completely overhaul. Because what you're doing right now, and I say this to people all the time when they're starting up for nutrition, the way you eat right now, you eat like that because it's convenient, it suits some preferences, and it just kind of suits where you are right now. Like, the foods you like there, like that are in your diet, you like them. We're not going to change anything massive here. I'm just going to give you a couple of recommendations here, maybe to add to this meal and that meal and that meal. And then over time, as they kind of get a little bit more kind of a taste for those foods, or they maybe start to like ask for a little more challenge, then we add it in. And then they might discover, okay, maybe I don't actually need the frozen pizzas or the frozen, like, you know, chicken gievs or whatever like that. And they just start to like move all that stuff out in place of stuff that maybe suits their goal a little bit more. And then all of a sudden they've got to this place of they're a lot more in control of their nutrition, but it wasn't at the expense of their sanity.
100%. Yeah, it's everything, right? It's different than training, because training is something that, if you want to be successful in building muscle or strength, you need to incorporate it to make it part of your life, like we talked about earlier, making it a commitment, something you do. But everybody eats. It's not an option. You got to. So if you make it something that requires all of your attention, and something that you have to focus on and think about and study and agonize over the different source of protein you're on, it is quite a jarring experience, a barrier to your life, and you're introducing a pretty big wrench into the gears of someone's social, cultural, familial, and potentially even like religious influenced decisions, right? Depending upon the person. So you have to really think about it from that same perspective, is that we're going to eat. It's part of who we are. It's part of the human experience. So it can't just be all about manipulating variables from a very kind of quantitative reductionist perspective, regardless if you're focused on the nutrients or if you're focused on the numbers. Rather, like you said, it needs to be something that can be integrated into habits, and behavior change comes from being able to set it and forget it. Because that's what we typically do with our nutrition in life anyway. We've all been eating since we were born, I'm pretty sure, right? So you're going to have lunch today. You're probably going to have breakfast. Some people skip meals, but they do it intentionally, and they notice it, right? It's a disturbance to their day-to-day basis. So how do we take the day-to-day habits we have and then just make them all of a sudden being sport supportive or goal supportive? And I think when you view all nutrition changes through that lens, there's a big difference in the way you coach it. There's a big difference in even knowing what you're trying to get to. I think a lot of people who get into fitness for the first time, they expect that they need to be on the diet, focused on it, doing a thing. And it's a present, consistent part of their life rather than just what they do. And they really don't see consistent success or long-term adherence until they can shift over to being, this is just what I do. Yeah. So anything that gets in the way of making this just what I do is a really high cost decision to consider as an athlete or a coach. Like, okay, I'm doing something that is highly unsustainable. I am deciding to go on a diet that forces me to avoid 3/4 of the grocery aisles. Is this something I can do long term? Is this worth it? What's going to happen even after I successfully lose these 10 kilos? how am I going to keep that off if I don't plan to be avoiding 3/4 of the grocery store long term, right? So the answers to those questions are individual, context dependent, but the philosophy behind it of whatever I do needs to become integrated into my life and just what I do on a day-to-day basis is really important. And that's one of the reasons why I talk about what we describe as the default diet at 3D Muscle Journey. And that's the idea that an experienced competitor or athlete, they get to a point where the qualitative look of their day-to-day nutrition is identical during contest prep or off-season. And that's not to say that you're starving yourself in the off-season. Quantitatively, big differences, but qualitatively, very, very similar. So I eat the same meals roughly around the same time, and they have a similar composition, but you're going to see things like the carbohydrate source changing to be much more fibrous, complex, lower calorie. Like I like to have Greek yogurt before I go to bed. It might have higher fat and higher total calories in the off season versus being just sweetened, during prep. I might have 2 pieces of fruit with my lunch during the off season, and they're going to be higher calorie fruits. It's going to be a packet of berries and just 1 packet during prep, saving 150 calories right there. And those things, like, if you look at it, I still take a walk. I go to breakfast and I have a serving of protein and I have food, and I do that at each one of my meals. But I'm shifting from something like 2,800 calories to 1,800 calories, and I'm finding ways to get in more steps, but I'm still living the same life. And I think that is very different than most people who are kind of new entrants into the fitness space. It's all very intentional. They're all like very, very much focused on it. It's a big departure, and they even like to make changes that disturb their life because they feel like they're working towards something. And getting someone to get the right mindset around this needs to be something that we work towards integrating and being the new you. And like you said earlier, becoming someone who doesn't miss the gym. You want to become someone who follows this dietary pattern and incorporating it into your identity. That is it's a big ask. It's a long-term project, but ultimately that's the only way that things work, is if that is eventually what they become. So anything that is a barrier to that occurring is probably not a good strategy for a nutrition or training prescription for that matter.
Mm-hmm. I remember from one of your mass videos, it was on like lean habits, and one of like the thing that I always like tell my clients off the back of that is when you're talking about acceptance commitment therapy, and how that, like, for long-term approaches like that, like with the nutrition, right? Even if you said, right, I want to cut out sugar, which, like, it's that like avoidance goal versus, like, the approach goal kind of tendency. Even if you set that as a goal, right, like you have to like accept that you're going to fail on that at some point. You're going to slip up. You're going to eat sugar. You might eat an apple that has sugar or something, right? Somebody might spike your Coke Zero with and give you normal Coca-Cola instead, So like these things in life are going to happen, and I think that's something that, like, no matter your goal, you do have to like just like accept that the path to that goal is going to be fraught with like inconsistencies, fuck ups, like but it's just part of it. It's as part of the goal as actually achieving the goal itself. And I think like the sooner that people can like see that with nutrition, I think it kind of gives them a lot more freedom, because I've been doing this for a long time. You've been doing it for longer than I have. And, we've had days where maybe our diet wasn't as good as, it could be if we were to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10 or something like that from some arbitrary, like, health standards or something. We've had, like, days where, we maybe didn't make the best decision in the gym from, like, a loading perspective or something like that. Maybe it's just, like, we've just, like, fallen short of the mark on, like, some of the targets that we set for ourselves. And that's okay. You just keep moving on. You just keep showing up the next day, day after that, day after that, day after that. Maybe you learn from like some of the failures that you have. Maybe you don't, but that's okay. You just keep moving on. And I think the more you can kind of remind yourself of that kind of journey, it is so much easier to like just kind of acknowledge those like hard times and just like get back onto it. And I think that's the biggest thing that people, well, like a huge thing that people struggle with from nutrition, for the ones that I coach, is that trying to be too perfect, trying to have the rigid mentality, inflexible standards, and the ones who typically do the best, they're the ones who are a lot more lax. You know, like once you start to, I guess, become more relaxed about it, everything becomes so much easier, because like even the stress component of trying to be perfect like inhibits you from your goal, because it becomes less enjoyable. Like you start like to fear things that you probably do really want to do, but because of somebody has told you, you've read an unhelpful Instagram post or something like that, or somebody said you're going to be not optimal because you are going to be eating this food or something like that. It's like, you know, has red dye 40 in it or something like that. You're just like, fuck, my life is ruined.
Yeah. Knowing what are the key variables and then being able just to integrate that is that's the whole reason the books exist. You know, like I remember when I was still doing full-time coaching, how often in the one-off consultations I did, in addition to my weekly check-ins with my more regular clients, that people had the same confusion and sticking points, and it came not because they didn't know enough, it's because they knew too much and they couldn't sort it all, and they couldn't create a hierarchy or a system out of it. And, you know, they were evaluating the need to have, you know, peri-workout nutrition just as high as hitting calories, you know, and they're just overwhelmed by all of it. And that problem is only exponentially increased in the last, you know, few years, right? So I think, yeah, you're 100% right. And people may have heard all of the correct information, but can't either parse it from the partially incorrect information, the pseudoscience, misinformation, or they've got all the correct information, but geez, they're just overwhelmed by all of it. So trying to get people to be able to focus on what are the big rocks first before I then move on to the pebbles and the grains of sand can be an absolute game changer. And it is, you know, how the work gets done. Because if, going back to your point of things should become habitual or automated, when the goal is to automate the big rocks and then eventually automate the pebbles, and then depending upon your level of goal, you decide whether or not you need to automate grains of sand as well. And I think what we see, you're talking about how some bodybuilders are like, oh, you just don't want it bad enough. They just don't understand the difference. You know, it's so much of it's context dependent. Like when you're in the last, say, 2 kilos of fat loss that you need to do during contest prep, and your energy expenditure is a lot lower. Like let's say you're eating 1,600 calories, you know, and you're only trying to lose a couple hundred grams a week of fat, because if you try to lose faster than that, you lose muscle. You can erase your deficit just by eyeballing clean foods, you know? You know, like you should probably weigh your broccoli, right? Because you're trying to achieve a 200 calorie deficit on 1,600 calories, right? So, I mean, you accidentally get some olive oil in there and the day's over for your deficit. But someone eyeballing broccoli and eating broccoli regularly and going, I think it's roughly a bowl. And that's great. Fantastic. Like, that's amazing in almost every other situation I can think of, right? So I think it's very difficult sometimes for bodybuilders to have that perspective, because we're so proximal to the thing that we know works very well. And it's not even factually incorrect. Like, in some contexts, you do need to weigh your broccoli. But in 99.9% of the time, not only do you not need to, it's probably the sign of you're developing an eating disorder. So I think we just have to be able to have that nuance and understand when and how to apply these things. So that's something that is not typically able to be delivered in a 90-second reel, my friend. But, you know, it is still very important.
Yeah, it's the difference between bodybuilding and the general populace, right? It's like, and people who don't have as, like, you know, like insane goals. It's like there has to be a certain level of result that's going to be delivered on stage. Certain standards you have to hold yourself to, and just certain things that you have to do. But to hold that same level of like in intensity to somebody who wants to go like on holiday, or somebody who just wants to lose like 5 kilos or something like that, it's just like it can be setting them up for failure, you know? Like, of course, if somebody wants to have that type of approach, if somebody wants to have that like kind of gung ho type, like real dialed in approach, like, you can give them a try. But I definitely find that like a lot of people have to like kind of like tiptoe into that, unless they're like the like real like analytically minded people who, you know, it's like people who open up their spreadsheet and just everything is just filled out like like without fail all the time, you know. Whereas you look at somebody else's spreadsheet and it's just like what am I looking at here? There's potholes everywhere.
Yeah, for sure.
And I also, just another thing that I think is like with nutrition, it's easier to become a pro in nutrition than it is with the likes of training. I find like you can get yourself up to a very acceptable and like kind of a very acceptable standard of with your nutrition, like form habits and form, you know, a good structure to your day. Whereas I think a lot of people maybe have a bit of a harder time with training. I guess, of course, like since your first book came out, there's been so much that's come out on the training side of things, right? Like, I think when your first books came out, like the Schoenfeld meta-analysis, were they out by then, or was that kind of later on? That was later on. Was it more around the time of the second book, right? Because I remember your reps, the reps kind of recommendations like 40 to 70 reps or something like that for volume, and like I was like, I'm doing way fucking more than that. But like now, there's been so much stuff coming out. It's like coming out all the time. Like I was like, how can people even be writing books? There's something coming out every day. There's like the one that came out the other day about the leg press, and was it the I
100 degrees or full range of motion?
Yes, yeah. That one, like, you know.
And even a couple days ago, there was one that came out. I think it's literally 2 days ago, that compared preacher curls to incline curls. A new study.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then a couple weeks ago, there was one that was dumbbell lateral raises versus cable lateral raises with the cable.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
And like, I really like seeing all that stuff coming out. Of course, like I think it's interesting. I think there's obviously the field of people who are getting frustrated, and they're like, why is this stuff even being studied? Like, you know, wasted time, small sample sizes, blah blah blah, without being able to just appreciate that it is happening. Like, you know, whereas like, again, when your first books came out, there was like not much. Like, you know, you kind of have to pull research from like other areas, maybe pull from like the different sports, like in endurance sports. Whereas like now there's like training, like studies done in actual people who are lifting specifically to grow their muscles. That's it, like just for the fun of it, you know. But I guess like with all that coming out, there's probably a lot more paralysis by analysis that's starting to, right? There's like dumbbell lat raises and cable lat raises, there wasn't like much of a difference there, so you know, screw the cable lat raise, you know. And as you kind of mentioned in the podcast, like maybe they were not doing like the entirety of the range of motion where you get like more of a stretch with the elbow coming in line with the body. And that's definitely something that, like, you know, we'd see in practice. Like, I know when I'm doing that exercise in practice, like, I do behind the back and I let my elbow track behind my back, get better stretch, etc. But I think, again, people are just becoming a little more kind of in their head when it does come to the training, versus just kind of coming back to what has worked for them up until this point, which is just the training. Like, seeing themselves as like, you're an N of 1. And for that kind of study to take place in yourself, you have to give something enough time before you make a change to see if, like, you know, protocols work, right? Like,
yeah, I think the thing that is, so I mean, look at it this way: in the first editions, which came out over 10 years ago, every bit of research that could be applied to bodybuilding was seen as gold because it was rare. Now we have enough coming out, and it's not that it is like, oh my God, why is all this stuff being coming out? It's so small. Like, the perception is also amplified by the fact that every new relevant study that comes out is a content opportunity for evidence-based content producers. And the way that content is presented has not changed since every bit of research was considered gold. So now it is presented as there's a new piece of gold that changes the game every 3 hours. And I think we do need to bear some responsibility for the fact that the content treadmill does produce an inaccurate view of the importance of these studies. Even though many of the good content producers will talk about how it is just one drop in the bucket that is slowly forming our overall impression, the title, the thumbnail, the urgency, the frequency, it gives the impression of whiplash. So, like you see the study come out and people are like, oh, long muscle lengths in shambles. And then another study comes out and then it shows long muscle lengths are beneficial. Like, oh, you're flip-flopping. Or like you said, man, all these studies, they keep changing because it's small sample sizes. So this is why it's so important in my books, to why I've tried to educate the reader a little bit around how do they actually sift through all this stuff. Because someone who's complaining about the fact that we've had all these N of 10 to 20 studies and they seem to be coming out every day is forgetting that that's the reason why we now have a 3,000 person meta-regression on training to proximity to failure, because you can take every single one of those studies and collate them together. And in fields where you can't get large sample size studies, meta-analyses done well are the top of the hierarchy of evidence, because you can take them, and if you do them properly, you can get by the barriers we have of why we have these divergent results study to study. People really struggle with the concept of what's called sampling variance. And sampling variance is a simple concept that doesn't fit with the way we like to evaluate the world. So sampling variance tells us that if there's a known population, all trained lifters on the planet, so we got 900 million people, right? That population, we will never know the true change in them, but we can get a sufficiently good probabilistic estimate of how they will change on average, not for you as an individual, but on average, the typical response, if we have a large enough sample. And it doesn't take a tremendous amount. Thousands will do it, right? Thousands is a big ask when you're struggling to get 20 trained lifters in your study. But when there's hundreds of labs who are doing that 20-person study and putting out a study, each one of those labs individually 2 to 3 times per year, and they do it for 10 years, we get to 1,000 pretty quick, and we're there. And that tells us with a level of precision that a pretty high degree of confidence about these general responses. But we don't get there without those 10-person studies. But the individual studies, if you look at them, can really confuse you because of sampling variance. So a sample is just a portion of that population. And because it's only 10 or 20, there's a decent chance, not a high probability, but a decent chance that we can get a non-representative sample. So if the one true population we know is going to get, say, 15% better gains from doing cable lateral raises than dumbbell lateral raises, we might have to do 7 studies before we see it lean 5 and 2 or 4 and 3. And it won't be until we have hundreds of participants that we can do a meta-analysis and go, actually, no, there's a small beneficial effect from doing cable lateral raises. But in the interim, when you see these studies pop up, and it could be just random chance that, hey, the first 3 studies that come out indicate no significant difference at all. And, collectively, because we're not thinking about it mathematically or probabilistically, as a community, we go, well, that shuts the door. The delts are unique. There's something about their length-tension relationship. Long muscle lengths for the delts are bullshit, and anyone promotes that's an idiot. And then 4 studies come out in a row, boom, 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 finding the opposite. And now people are thinking there's been some type of nefarious thing. And they'll pick apart the methods. And sometimes there is a reason, because of the way the study was ran, that the outcome occurred. But sometimes it's literally due to completely extraneous factors. If it was a crossover design, well, the time when you got assigned to the cable lateral raise, you actually got a new protein supplement, and it was amino acids spiked, and you were getting 30 less grams of essential amino acids that you knew. Or you know what? Your kitten got sick for those 8 weeks, and your sleep was trash, right? you know what, you actually went through a brutal divorce and you were, so stressed during that time period you couldn't adapt as well to training. And this random occurrences of all the things that we can't control in studies that could impact your outcome. Or hey, you are actually fighting off an illness. You had COVID, but you're asymptomatic, and it compromised your immune system enough to where you couldn't adapt as well to training. Literally, almost an infinite number of things contribute to outcomes impacting the results in studies. That's the whole reason we don't just have an N of 1 study, and we go, oh, well, actually, Eric, you told me, I saw what you did the minimum effective dose. I don't need PAX research. Well, how do you know that it wasn't the billion other things going on in Eric Helms' life? And also, how do you know that Eric Helms represents the average? He probably doesn't. So we need enough of a large enough sample to protect against sampling variance, and also to make sure that it's representative of the sample. Because even if nothing goes wrong, it may just be that you got 10 hyper responders, or you got 10 hypo responders. So all of those things are roughly taken into account by sampling variance. And I'm not saying you shouldn't scrutinize the methods and think maybe why did it go one way when there's especially a glaring flaw. They didn't do momentary failure. They did voluntary failure, and they did high reps with untrained people. Maybe their comparison of RIR to failure is not fair, right? Absolutely. But if we're nitpicking relatively well-done studies when they've got 10 to 20 people because of an outcome that we didn't anticipate, maybe it was just random chance. And that is why it's so important that all this research is coming out, and why it's not that hard to write my book, because I don't need to change the chapter about training at longer muscle lengths to say, no, this dumbbell lateral raise study threw a wrench in everything. Because instead what I do is I look at, okay, the isometric training data, the exercise manipulation training data, the data on lengthened partials, the data on stretching, collectively, all together, and a couple of systematic reviews and a meta-analysis or two. What does that tell me? Okay, so there is this new study on lateral raises that didn't seem to make a difference whether you're training with a cable and it should be a better resistance profile at a longer delt length. How much does that move the needle? And I can actually teach the reader to some degree, like, okay, there's a study of 20, but like when I represent some of the data that I'm suggesting they listen to on volume, I say, hey, in this 2024 meta-regression of 36 studies and over 1,000 participants, they found this. But then in a later chapter, if we move to the less important parts of the pyramid, I can say, yeah, in these 3 studies, a total of 60 people, things seem to be leaning this way, and here's my anecdotal experience. Therefore, we think this is it, And the reader starts to get an idea of the confidence of the author in the topic, and knowing that they're getting the best recommendation possible based upon what's available, rather than it just being like, do this.
Yeah.
And I think that is just so important for people to get an accurate gauge of what they do with all this information. Because so much of the pushback against science right now comes from how it's communicated, rather than the actual science itself, whether the critiquers realize it or not,
Yeah. I think that's it's an important thing for people to take away. Just as you mentioned at the very kind of end of that, like, you're looking at the totality of all the work that's out there. You're not looking at that one study to kind of tilt you in one direction. Because I think that's one of the things that people are maybe trying to put out, some information that maybe suits the kind of bias that they have. Like, it could be to do with, like, motor unit recruitment or stuff like that. They'll just pick like one kind of study, and they will just say, hey, like, ignore all the stuff out there that's conducted poorly. Look at this study. You should trust me and trust this study because I think it's great and supports my bias. And it, like, just with a narrative that's kind of spun around the paper, it can get people very, very easily to go down that side of things. And again, as you said, like, just with the flashiness and kind of like the content treadmill, as you put it, it's very easy to see anything that comes out, like, and just be like, maybe I should make a change here to my daily routine. Maybe, like, ice baths, all that kind of stuff popping up. There seems to be always like a new paper that comes up there kind of saying one thing, then another thing, and one thing, then another thing. And again, training is kind of undergoing that type of revolution too. But I think what a lot of people can take as well from some of the training stuff that's coming out now is like it gives more options, you know. Like I remember when the volume study came out, with the volume study, you know, the one with the one with the 52 sets, the Enas or something,
Yeah,
Enas,
yep.
Enas, yeah. Remember when that one came out and everybody's like kind of crying about it, for lack of a better word. Like I was just thinking that like it just kind of shows it's not that you're gonna prescribe somebody 52 sets. It's just to say that hey, we can potentially do a little bit more than we thought. That's great. That's cool to know that the human body is more robust. It's more adaptable than we previously thought. If that situation ever arrives, I'm not gonna sweat if I have to give somebody an extra 5 sets on a muscle group to maybe kind of help them overcome a plateau. I'm not gonna bring them from their existing 20 up to 50 because the study says so, but I won't feel like I'm going to like subject them to an absolute misery or something that will be completely ineffective or will cause them to regress, because we know that maybe there is a higher ceiling and we're a bit more kind of robust and resilient than we once thought, you know. So I think it's some of those kind of like lessons you can take from the studies, and even just like as you were talking there with the dumbbell lat raise and the cable lat raise, like that just says to me, okay, you know, before that study came out, people were like, dumbbell lat raise is a waste of time. You know, resistance profile is terrible. You may as well just like not do it at all if you're going to be training your delts, so you can't do a cable lat raise. And that says to me, oh, so if the cables are busy, you're in a time crunch, just grab a pair of dumbbells, do your lat raises, and you'll still get a good stimulus. Like, I think that's a positive. You know,
it's good news. Yeah.
I don't think the fact says no, it's not statistically significant is a bad thing. Like that's just how you're choosing to view it.
Absolutely. And so much of what I also tried to do in the edition of these books is help people understand what the data is not telling them. Because, like, I think many people, they would look at that and go, oh, so 52 sets is possible. Even framed the way you said it, some people still forget that science doesn't tell us everything. We want it to, right? Because then we have these clear answers and it feels emotionally satisfying and safe, to be perfectly honest. But when I say, hey, you've got this meta-regression that includes NS and another 70 studies, you know, and over 1,000 participants, that shows this relationship that as we get up even as high as maybe 30 sets per muscle group, there seems to be relatively clear benefits. That is not saying that you should always train every muscle group in perpetuity for 30 sets to failure, because that was what we found. Because no one studied your whole career and what produced the most muscle growth in everybody. That's not a thing. And I think we forget that. So like we see an 8 to 12 week study, and I think in the meta-regression by Robinson on volume, the average study length was 10.5 weeks. And we look at these hypertrophy studies and we assume they are similar bodybuilding protocols to what we do in the real world, 4 to 6 days per week, right? You know, similar exercise selection, population, all that stuff. But in reality, what we're doing is we're looking at studies where we're measuring muscle growth sometimes in one muscle, right? There's a study that compares moderate, high, and low volumes in just bicep curls that's included in that meta-regression. Not just one study, dozens, right? So there are studies that have a full body protocol. There are studies that have what I would describe as, on a lot of these, a specialization cycle, right? I'm taking an ultrasound probe. I'm looking at changes in your biceps, your quad, and your triceps. You better be damn well sure that those are the muscle groups, because I can measure them, that we're going to be doing these different volume manipulations. And we may be manipulating volume for other muscle groups, but more than likely, so I don't have to pay as many research assistants for as long of a time or ask you to come to the gym more than 3 days per week, we're going to do kind of like a minimum amount on these other muscle groups, just enough to keep these trained participants from dropping out of the study, because they're like, listen, I'm not going to go 8 weeks and not do hamstring curls, right? So we actually care about quadricep hypertrophy, but we're only going to do 8 sets for everybody on hamstrings, right? That's a very normal thing in research. But you read the study and you go, sweet, so all muscle groups for 12 years, not 12 weeks, I should be doing 30 sets. And it's like, well, no, actually, all we really know is that if I said, hey, do you know how you can grow the most amount of muscle possible in 3 muscle groups in 2 to 3 months? It's by doing a crap ton of work. And it's like, duh, like we kind of already knew that.
Yeah.
So what the data really tells us is that for short-term periods, you can grow a little bit more with very, very high volumes. But there's a diminishing returns effect. You know, your first 4 sets or so your first 10 sets are like 3 times as effective as like your last, 30 to 40 if you were to get that high, right? And you may or may not be able to sustain that long term. We don't know because we don't have studies that are that long term. So people want the study to tell them more than it does, and also to give some responsibility to the science communicators. They are communicated sometimes and told that the study tells them how to train all the time. You know, if you were to just mishmash meta-regressions altogether, you should do, 30 sets to failure, doing, long muscle lengths all the time. And we know from practice that there are limits to what we can do. And when we're looking at the independent effects of these variables in isolation, that's not the same as stacking them all together. And that's where we must rely on anecdotes. And it's not that anecdotes are better than science. It's that science can't do everything for us. We don't have studies that can tell us the complicit interaction of all these things. Maybe when we have a conversation 10 years from now and I've got gray hair and I'm launching the 5th editions, perhaps that'll be the case, but we ain't there yet. So that means we have to communicate. Maybe even it's more important to communicate the limitations of the data rather than what the data tells us.
Yeah, I love that. Eric, I really, really appreciate your time. And it's been a great conversation. I'm sure that anybody who's listening to this is a lot smarter at the end of it too. So man, really, really appreciate you coming on, and especially waking up, starting the podcast at 6 a.m. in all the way in New Zealand. So at least it's a good start to the day, right?
It's a lovely start to the day, and I appreciate you. You're carving out your dinner for me, and I wake up at this time anyway, so it's no problem at all. Thank you for having me on, and I really do hope that this has been a useful conversation to your listeners.
Do you want to just tell people where they can find you? Because there's going to be people who are listening to podcasts who've never heard of who you are, so feel free to plug your links, all that kind of good stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do the science communication thing on a lot of different platforms. Probably the best place to kind of see what I'm up to is Instagram at Helms 3DMJ. If you're interested in bodybuilding, definitely check out 3dmusclejourney.com. That is the number 3, the letter D, followed by Muscle Journey. We've got an amazing set of coaches who I act as the chief science officer to, and I'm still a part-time coach. I was one of the founders of 3D Muscle Journey. But we try to lead the space in sustainable evidence-based practice for drug-free lifters, both powerlifters and bodybuilders, whether you're competitive or recreational, and you just want to get as strong and big as possible, or you want to actually don the Speedos or the posing suit, or you want to don the singlet and get under the bar. That is something we would be more than happy to support you in. And if you're not looking for coaching, but you do want to find more information and courses, we also have the 3DMJ Vault, where we have a tremendous number of courses that you can get by joining. And if you really love the nerdy stuff that I talked about, you can absolutely get the books, muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. People who have the 2nd edition will get the 3rd edition. That's the promise we made. So, even if you're eager and you don't want to wait for the 3rd edition to come out, you're basically buying the 2nd edition plus updates if you do buy them now. But they're probably the 3rd edition is going to come out sometime end of 1st quarter, 2nd quarter. I've actually fully written the training book, and I'm working on the nutrition book. Now, there's obviously a lot of editing and stuff that goes on. But anyway, muscleandstrengthpyramids.com, more info there. And then finally, if you want to stay up to date with the research, but not feel like it's whiplash, like we talked about, and get an understanding of how it fits into the broader data on a monthly basis, check out Mass Research Review, where we actually review this research on a monthly basis, an issue that comes out on the 1st, never late, along with Dr. Eric Trexler, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. And we've got audio summaries, we've got video content, we've gotten written stuff. You'll get over 1,000 pieces of content because we started this back in 2017, and we have not stopped, and it is, oh my God, 2025. So that's all the places you can find me doing my thing, and you can engage with the level of nerdiness that you would like to.
And you can also listen to Iron Culture as well.
100%. Yes.
Yeah, God. Traxler is getting, he's got a little bit of love there with the mask shout out.
A little bit. You can't give Trexler too much love. It goes to his head.
All right. So, yeah, thank you very much, Eric. If you enjoy the podcasts, do make sure to go over and follow Eric on Instagram and have a look through all of the material there that you recommended. Mass is something I've been subscribed to since I started PTing, and of course I've been coached by 3DMJ too, so I obviously have Eric on the podcast, so I very much stand behind the brand and stand behind everything they stand for. So go over and check them out. Also, if you did enjoy the podcast, leave a rating and review on the podcast platform that you're listening on, and we will catch you next week.